Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for being here this evening. This lecture this evening is being given in conjunction with the current exhibition that is now in the Norma Jean Calderwood Galleries here at the Athenaeum, George and Martha Washington, Gilbert Stuart's Athenaeum Portraits. If you haven't seen the show, I hope you will. We are taking the extra measure tonight of leaving the gallery open after the lecture, so it will be available for viewing. The show will be here at the Athenaeum through May 13th, so we hope you'll come back and see it many times. It's a wonderful opportunity to acknowledge the great works of art that are known as the Athenaeum Portraits, because they did live here for quite a while. And they are back with us through the generosity of the National Portrait Gallery in Washington and the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston. These institutions jointly own the paintings, and they live in both cities. And it worked out very well for us that we were able to celebrate them and celebrate their connection to this very historic institution. We acquired the portraits initially from Gilbert Stuart's widow shortly after the artist's death, and the portraits lived here first in our Pearl Street home and then here in this building until they went to the Museum of Fine Arts in the 1870s. I'm sure this is all very familiar to many of you, but we have retold the story, both the 19th century story and the more recent, rather interesting story of what happened to the portraits later, which you can investigate in the exhibition. And in the galleries, they have been joined by a number of works of art from our own collection, which is very rich in images of both the Washingtons, which the exhibition seeks to celebrate. So please do go in there after the lecture, leaving your cheese and crackers and wine outside. Otherwise, George and Martha might get jealous. But we hope you'll enjoy all of that. As a historian of American art, it gives me a special pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Oh, there you are. Ellen Miles is curator and chair of the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where she was recently selected as the Smithsonian Secretary's Distinguished Research Lecturer. She is a graduate of Bryn Mawr College, holds a Ph.D. in art history from Yale University, and is one of the world's leading authorities on American portraiture, a well-deserved position that is witnessed by her many publications in this field. These include American Colonial Portraits, 1700 to 1776, which was published in 1987 on the occasion of the groundbreaking exhibition of the same title, the Magisterial Saint Memon and the Neoclassical Profile Portrait in America, which came out in 1994, American Paintings of the 18th Century, a publication of 1995, which is part of the National Gallery of Art's series of systematic catalogs of its collection. And here, more to the point, George and Martha Washington, Portraits from the Presidential Years, which was published in 1999. A Brush with History, Paintings from the National Portrait Gallery, published in 2001. And the essay, Gilbert Stuart's Portraits of George Washington, which was published in the exhibition catalog, George Washington, A National Treasure, which was published in 2002. As if these accomplishments were not impressive enough, Dr. Miles has also been the recipient of a number of fellowships and grants, the most recent of which is a Getty Curatorial Research Fellowship, which she received for research for the monumental exhibition Gilbert Stuart, which was jointly organized by and presented at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the National Portrait Gallery in 2004 and 2005. Dr. Miles served as co-curator of that exhibition and co-author of the accompanying catalog, which we have copies for sale tonight outside, which you're welcome to look at, and Dr. Miles will be available to sign these as well. Obviously, there are few, if any, scholars who would be better qualified to speak to us tonight on Dr. Miles's topic, Familiar Faces, Gilbert Stuart's Portraits of Martha and George Washington. Please join me in welcoming Ellen Miles.
So what do I do after Gilbert Stuart? That's the question everybody asks. Anyway, so we'll start with the first two slides, I think. I hope you can see the slides. You don't need to look at me. You just see the slides. Okay. George Washington was Stuart's most important sitter. Stuart's portraits of Washington have carried the artist's reputation far into time. Stuart painted three portraits of Washington from life. These have been known since the mid-19th century by the names of their first owners. On the left, you see the Vaughan-type portrait, a bust-length portrait that faces to our right, named for Samuel Vaughan, a late 18th century London merchant, an admirer of Washington who owned this version of the portrait. On the right, of course, the Athenaeum, named for the Boston Athenaeum, which owned the painting and the pendant portrait of Martha Washington for almost 150 years, from 1831, as David had said, 3 years after Stuart's death, until 1980, when they were purchased jointly by the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston and the National Portrait Gallery, and the Lansdowne Portrait, named for the Marquis of Lansdowne, the British supporter of American independence, to whom it was sent as a gift in 1796 by William Bingham of Philadelphia. Stuart documented these life portraits in 1823 in his notes on a letter. There we go. That he owned, that George Washington had written to him in 1796 to arrange a sitting for the Lansdowne portrait. The letter reads at the top, "Sir, I am under promise to Mrs. Bingham to sit for you tomorrow at 9 o'clock, and wishing to know if it be convenient to you that I should do so, and whether it shall be at your own house, as she talked of the State House, I send this note to you to ask information. I am, sir, your obedient servant, G. Washington." The inscription below, signed by Stuart, reads, "In looking over my papers to find one that had the signature of George Washington, I found this one, asking me when he should sit for his portrait, which is now owned by Samuel Williams of London." This is written, as I said, in 1823. And Stuart continued, "I've thought it proper the letter be his, especially as he owns the only original painting I ever made of Washington, except the one I own myself, the Athenaeum portrait, which he still owned. I painted a third, but rubbed it out. I now present this to his brother, Timothy Williams, for said Samuel." And as a side note, what's interesting about Samuel is that he was an American merchant living in London, and he had purchased the Lansdowne portrait after the death of the Marquis of Lansdowne about 20 years earlier. And the following year, in 1824, he and his brother Charles commissioned Stuart to paint this wonderful portrait of their mother, Lydia Pickering Williams, one of Stuart's great portraits of an elderly sitter. Today, I plan to look at the Athenaeum portraits more closely. We will begin with the paintings themselves. Then I will talk briefly about Gilbert Stuart and his career up to the year he painted the portrait, 1796. Third, I will tell you a little about George Washington as a sitter. And finally, we will return to the paintings. When you look at the two Athenaeum portraits of George and Martha Washington in the exhibition, you may have noticed that Stuart did not finish the compositions. He completed the heads, which are surrounded by a dark circular area, and this was done to provide a bit of background color against which he selected the highlights and shading of the faces. This enabled him to give the images a sense of volume. The remaining areas of the canvas are unpainted. The oval patterns that are faintly visible in the slides show that the canvas has changed color slightly by being exhibited for many years in the wonderful frames that are on the portraits today, and you should look at the frames as much as the portraits in the exhibition. These frames, we believe, were made for the portraits in 1831. Details of the portraits reveal Stuart's masterful technique. First, I'll show you some details of Martha, with its loose brushwork in which the colors are left unblended and are placed next to each other to indicate highlighted areas, shadows, and reflected light. So let's see more of Martha. And you're lucky, in the exhibition you can go right up to the pictures and see these really well. But this, I think, will help you. You can see the sort of zigzag of the paint when he's painting the ruff of her cap. And then next we'll look at some details of George's portrait. It's extraordinarily fresh. The colors are unblended and placed directly on the canvas. The nice thing for a curator is to have these portraits at the museum so that I can go up and stare at them as much as I want. I'm sure David's doing that here. Stuart's colors are fairly limited, as you can see on this modern facsimile of his palette, made for me by Maryland artist Ed Ahlstrom, who has studied and copied Stuart's portraits. This is based on a drawing that a young American artist did of Stuart's palette in 1816. Stuart developed his technique during years in England, where he learned to paint in the manner of English portrait painters Joshua Reynolds and Thomas Gainsborough. Stuart's training as an artist took place in the British Isles, where he lived for more than 18 years. Despite this long stay in Britain, Stuart was an American artist. He was born in colonial America in Kingston, Rhode Island, where his father, an immigrant Scot, operated a snuff mill. When Stuart was about 6 years old, the family moved to nearby Newport, where they opened a shop that sold tobacco and dry goods. After Stuart served as an apprentice to a Scottish itinerant portrait painter named Cosmo Alexander, who had come to the colonies in the 1760s, Stuart accompanied Alexander to Edinburgh at the age of 16 and spent a year in Scotland. His earliest surviving portraits were painted after he returned to America. This is a pair of John Bannister of Newport on the left, of course, and his wife Christian and their son John on the right. They show the influence in their technique of contemporary Scottish and also American colonial painting, including the work of Boston artist John Singleton Copley. Another early portrait of Stuart's is of his friend Benjamin Waterhouse, painted 2 months before Waterhouse's departure for London in 1775 to study medicine. The portrait is the earliest example of Stuart's close representation of a sitter's features, a hallmark of his work throughout his career. Stuart also went to London in 1775, on the eve of the American Revolution. This is his self-portrait from 1778, painted in London in imitation of a Dutch painter's self-portrait. He later said that he was sent to London by his father, quote, to get me out of harm's way. His family, who were loyalists, had left Rhode Island for Nova Scotia. In London, Stuart contacted American painter Benjamin West, who had settled in London in 1763. He joined West as an assistant in 1777 and worked in West's studio for 5 years, painting the backgrounds in West's large history paintings. In 1782, Stuart painted this very well-known painting, known as The Skater, of William Grant, who was a Scottish barrister. It received considerable praise when it was exhibited at the Royal Academy, and this enabled Stuart to go out on his own as a portrait painter. Stuart was in London during one of the great decades of British portrait painting. He was able to see portraits by contemporary artists in public exhibitions and artist studios, and no doubt read reviews in newspapers. Stuart adopted elements of their approaches to portraiture. These included painting directly on the canvas. And to give you an example of this, I'm showing you a later portrait that Stuart painted of circus rider John Bill Ricketts. You can see that he's drawing with paint directly on the canvas. He's not drawing drawings on paper. He's not drawing with pencil on the canvas or chalk. He's just taking his brush and sketching the composition out directly. Stuart also learned the British technique of approach to portraiture, which is a way of showing you not only what the person looked like, but something about their life, their career. This is Benjamin West, his mentor, seen with the Bible, a copy of the Bible, and then in the background, one of his large religious paintings that he was painting for George III. This is Moses receiving the laws. Stuart had worked on part of this on this painting when he was in West's studio. In London, Stuart also learned the business of portrait painting, including the practice of charging half price at the first sitting. The balance was to be paid when the portrait was finished. He also learned to favor fine twill English canvas, which is a slightly rougher weave of canvas, and he learned to use the pre-cut sizes that English portrait artists used, ranging from the full-length size, this is a life-size full-length canvas, about 80 by 50 inches. This is a captain, a British captain, to the smaller portraits, and especially the waist-length and knee-length portraits. In 1787, a reviewer of Stuart's work praised his work, saying, "In the most arduous and valuable achievements of portrait painting, identity and duration, Stuart takes the lead of every competitor. Stuart dives deep into the mind and brings up with him a conspicuous draft of character and characteristic thought, all as sensible to feeling and to sight as the most palpable projection of any feature of a face." And again, we can see his success in observation with this portrait of Mohawk leader Joseph Brant, which he painted in London. About his approach to portraiture, Stuart later told the younger American artist Matthew Harris Jewett, "Most persons in striving after effect lose the likeness when they should go together. As your object is to copy nature, 'twere the height of folly to look at anything else to produce that copy." His close attention to the details of the face, the structure and its fleshy shapes, probably benefited from his attendance at the anatomy lectures of Dr. William Cruikshank of the London College of Surgeons. And Stuart was also aware of the traditional theories of physiognomy, which held that the external features of a person can be studied to reveal the inner character of that person. In 1787, after 12 years in London and after a marriage to Charlotte Coates, who was the sister of a physician that he knew at the London College of Surgeons, Stuart moved to Dublin, where he continued to paint portraits with great success for 6 years. But he was also developing a new plan to increase his income and to support his rather elegant lifestyle and his growing family. He decided to return to the United States to paint a portrait of George Washington. By this time, Washington was in his second term as president. Stuart told Irish painter John Dowling Herbert his plan. "When I can net a sum sufficient to take me to America, I shall be off to my native soil. There I expect to make a fortune by Washington alone. I calculate upon making a plurality of his portraits, whole lengths, and if I should be so fortunate, I will repay my English and Irish creditors. To England and Ireland I shall bid adieu." When Stuart returned to America in 1793, he was almost completely unknown. When he arrived in Philadelphia to paint the president, the young American artist Rembrandt Peale described Stuart only as an artist from Dublin. Now we turn to George Washington. I think we can safely say that he was a reluctant sitter for portraits, beginning in 1772 with the very first portrait that was painted of him by Charles Willson Peale on the left. The portrait shows Washington at the age of 40 in his uniform as a colonel in the Virginia militia. Washington hinted at his restlessness as a sitter in a letter to Jonathan Boucher, who had introduced Peale to the Washington family. Washington indicated to Boucher that he had not been inclined to sit, but that he had yielded to requests for the portrait. We believe that the request came from Martha Washington, since the portrait is the same size as a portrait of her, painted 10 years earlier, or more than 10, by itinerant English artist John Wollaston. In his letter to Boucher, Washington referred to the 18th century belief that a person's character could be interpreted from his or her features, and he worried that his inattentiveness during the sittings, when recorded by Peale, would misrepresent his character. And this is what he wrote. It's a wonderful quote. "Inclination having yielded to importunity, I am now, contrary to all expectation, under the hands of Mr. Peale. But in so grave, so sullen a mood, and now and then under the influence of Morpheus, which is sleep, the god of sleep, when some critical strokes are making, that I fancy the skill of this gentleman's pencil will be put to it in describing to the world what manner of man I am." By 1785, Washington had resigned himself to the demands of portrait painters. The Revolutionary War had ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, and people in both Europe and America were curious to see Washington's image. When English artist Robert H. Pine painted Washington's portrait that year, Washington wrote again about the experience of sitting, this time with the awareness that he changed his attitude. And David, I think you've quoted this in your catalog. I love this quote. "In for a penny, in for a pound is the old adage. I am so hackneyed to the touches of the painter's pencil that I am now altogether at their beck, and sit like patients on a monument while they are delineating the lines of my face. It is a proof among many others, he wrote, of what habit and custom can effect. At first, I was as impatient at the request and as restive under the operation as a colt is in the saddle. The next time, submitted very reluctantly, but with less flouncing. Now, no dray moves more readily to the thill, and that's the wagon shaft, the shaft of the wagon. No dray moves more readily to the thill than I do to the painter's chair. It may easily be conceived, therefore, that I yielded a ready obedience to your request and to the views of Mr. Pine. After 1789, when Washington was inaugurated first president of the United States, his portraits were especially in demand. While on a visit to Boston that year, the city selectmen asked him to sit for a portrait for Faneuil Hall. They explained that they wanted the portrait, quote, in behalf of the ladies who are ambitious of transmitting to their children a perfect likeness of their justly beloved president at the moment he blessed them with his presence, when his benign countenance made such an impression on their hearts as they wished to recognize in his portrait in future. When Washington went to Cambridge on that same trip, the president of Harvard College, Joseph Willard, showed him the collection of scientific instruments in the Philosophical Hall and asked Washington to sit for a portrait for Harvard. Edward Savage, an ambitious, self-taught Massachusetts painter and engraver, sought the commission. Joseph Willard wrote to Washington, when you were in the philosophy chamber of the university in this place, you may remember that I expressed my wishes that your portrait might sometime or other adorn that room. Since then, Mr. Savage, the bearer of this letter, who is a painter and going to New York, has called on me and of his own accord has politely and generously offered to take your portrait for the university, if you would be so kind as to sit. It would be exceedingly grateful to all the governors of this literary society that the portrait of the man we highly love, esteem, and revere should be the property of and be placed within Harvard College. Permit me, sir, to request the favor of your sitting for the purpose. And what you see here is Edward Savage's portrait. You'll remember something as I show you these portraits, two things, I think. First, all of them of Washington show him in uniform. Long after the Revolution, he was still the general. And in fact, I'm told that Martha Washington called him the general, even. And also, I'm showing you a variety of styles of portraits so that when we begin to look at the Stuart, I think you can see what the great difference is in the technique of the artist. Savage delivered Willard's letter to Washington in New York, and Washington agreed to sit from a wish that I have to gratify every reasonable desire of the patrons and promoters of science. He sat for about 7 hours in 3 sittings, and the resulting painting shows him in his uniform with the badge of the Order of the Cincinnati on the lapel. And this next one will surprise you, I think, because it's hard to believe that this is also George Washington. Let me see if I can. But this is a miniature that's quite well documented by Archibald Robertson, who was a Scottish portrait painter. Europeans also wanted portraits of Washington, which I think sometimes is surprising. 1791, the Scottish Earl of Buchan sent miniaturist Archibald Robertson to America with a commission to paint Washington's portrait for his collection. Because, as he wrote, Washington's presidency pleased, quote, the host of enlightened and liberal-minded Scottish patriots of every rank, who, deploring the abuses of the government under which they were born, i.e. the English, rejoiced in the happiness of their transatlantic kinsmen, having overthrown the English. With these comments in mind, we can now return to Stuart and the portraits he painted in 1795 and 96, toward the end of Washington's second term as president. When Stuart returned to America in 1793, after 18 years abroad, he was responding to this demand for portraits of the president from Europeans and Americans alike. Among his English patrons for such a portrait were Benjamin West, the Earl of Shelburne, who in the meantime had been elevated to the peerage as the Marquis of Lansdowne, and Shelburne had been the prime minister during the negotiations for the Treaty of Paris, and also Viscount Cremorne, whose wife was the granddaughter of William Penn. Stuart spent over a year in New York City painting portraits before he went to Philadelphia, which you may remember was the temporary capital of the United States. He took a letter of introduction to the president from Chief Justice John Jay, whose portrait he had recently painted. And this was necessary because Washington by this time had begun to turn down requests that he received from artists for portrait sittings. In 1792, when Virginia artist William Joseph Williams persuaded Henry Lee of Virginia to write a letter of introduction to Washington for a sitting, Washington had sent Lee his apologies. And this is wonderful, a comment. "To be frank," he wrote, "and I hope you will not be displeased with me for being so, I am so heartily tired of the attendance which from one cause or another I have bestowed on these kind of people," by which he means artists, "that it is now more than 2 years since I have resolved to sit no more for any of them, and have adhered to it, except in instances where it has been requested by public bodies or for a particular purpose not of the painters, and could not without offense be refused. I have been led to make this resolution for another reason besides the irksomeness of sitting and the time I lose by it, which is that these productions have, in my estimation, been made use of as a sort of tax upon individuals by being engraved, and that badly, and hawked or advertised for sale." So with Jay's letter, Stuart was able to get the sittings for the first portrait. And I showed you earlier another version of this Vaughan portrait. We're not sure, I believe, as he said on that letter, that he rubbed out the life portrait. So I'm showing you the one from the Frick Museum, which is different from the one that you saw earlier in the black coat. And I just want to point out here how little documentation we have for Stuart's portraits of Washington. I'll mention to you whenever we do have some documentation, but it's very, very little, especially very little coming from either Stuart or Washington. The best documentation comes from younger artists, notably Stuart's own daughter, Jane Stuart, a painter, as well as Rembrandt Peale and William Dunlap. But Jane Stuart wasn't born until, I think, 1813, so she was not living at the time that Stuart painted Washington. Stuart's first portrait of Washington is less familiar than the Athenaeum portrait. The portrait type gets its name from the version that I showed you earlier that was sent to London to Samuel Vaughan. Stuart's approach to portrait painting relied on his skill at conversation with the sitter in his studio, which was intended to relax the sitter so that he or she would adapt a characteristic pose that Stuart could paint. His close observation of the sitter was aided by his study of anatomy in London and his knowledge of the theory of physiognomy. The portrait of Washington that he sent to Samuel Vaughan was engraved and published in the last volume of the English translation of Johann Caspar Lavater's Essays on Physiognomy. Stuart may have been a subscriber to the early volumes of this important work, which were published just after he went to Dublin. Despite this approach, Stuart encountered difficulties in painting the first portrait of Washington, due apparently to Washington's tendency to, we might say today, tune out during sittings. William Dunlap, the first historian of American art and also a painter, wrote in 1834 of Stuart's difficulties in representing Washington. Stuart has said that he found more difficulty attending the attempt to express the character of Washington on his canvas than in any of his efforts before or since. It is known that by his colloquial powers he could draw out the minds of his sitters upon that surface he was tasked to represent, and such always was his aim. But Washington's mind was busied within. During the sitting for the first portrait, Stuart could not find a subject, although he tried many, that could elicit the expression he knew must accord with such features and such a man. Despite Stuart's apparent dissatisfaction with the first portrait, the portrait was successful, and about the time it was painted, Stuart compiled a list of 32 patrons who were willing to pay $100 apiece for a portrait that size of the head and shoulders. However, we only know of about a dozen versions of that first portrait. And this is because Stuart, with probably no chance for more sittings for this first painting, was then, luckily for him, commissioned by Martha Washington to paint these portraits. These were intended for display at Mount Vernon. Washington was approaching the end of his second term, and Martha hoped that when the figures were finished, when the portraits were finished, they would be taken to Mount Vernon and put on display there. When finished, the portraits would show two seated people facing each other, which was fairly typical of 18th century paired, or what we call pendant portraits. And I'm going to show you two very different portraits of a younger couple from New York City. But if you look here at the portraits, and you can see how Washington's head is turned to our left and Martha's to our right. This is the typical way that a pair of husband and wife. Somehow I never can get this second. It's just a matter of pointing at it. There it goes. Yeah, there it goes. This is a pair of Matilda Stanton, who was the daughter of the Spanish consul in Boston, John Stanton, and her Spanish diplomat husband, Josef de Jaudenes y Nebo. They were painted in New York in 1794 by Stuart at the time of their marriage. And you can see where the heads are on the canvas and the fact that they're turned toward each other. And you can imagine the Athenaeum portraits being finished in similar poses. We don't know how long, how many sittings took place for the two portraits. Typically, Stuart would have had 3 to 5 sittings, about 2 hours each. The sittings took place either in Philadelphia or in nearby Germantown, where Stuart moved his studio in the summer of 1796. There's only one reference in Washington's diary to Stuart, which may refer to these portraits. On January 7, 1797, he noted that he rode to Germantown with Mrs. Washington to see Stuart's paintings. There are, however, numerous comments about the sittings, which indicate how fascinated people were with both Stuart and, of course, Washington. According to Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, I'm just going to put on the other side, if it comes up, well, we'll see. The Portrait of Washington by Rembrandt Peale. There you go. It was painted about the same time. It's very interesting, isn't it? This is a portrait of Washington who was in 63, painted by a 17-year-old artist with no sense of romanticizing the image. I think it's a very interesting comparison. According to Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, during the sittings, the president was awakened when the painter began to talk about horses. Mrs. Basil Hall, who visited Stuart in Boston in 1827, recorded another reminiscence. In Stuart's painting room, there was an original painting he did of Washington, merely a head, the figure and drapery left unfinished. He amused us exceedingly by the account he gave us of the embarrassment at first as to how he was to get on with it. He found it such hard work to make General Washington speak on light subjects. However, he resolved to try at all hazards to make him laugh, and accordingly told him the old Joe Miller story of King James II's journey to gain popularity, in the course of which he arrived somewhere, and the mayor of the place was a baker, and he was no speechmaker, and he had to be prompted. So when his friend jogged his elbow and said, "Hold up your head and look like a man," the blundering mayor repeated the admonition to the king. This stupid story, as this is the continuing of Mrs. Hall's comment, this stupid story had the desired effect, and from that time on, said Mr. Stuart, I had him on a pivot and could manage him nicely. American writer Samuel Lorenzo Knapp also wrote of Stuart's difficulties in painting Washington. In the chair for the painter, Washington was apt to fall into a train of thought and become abstracted from the things around him. And of course, most of the likenesses of him show more of gravity of muscle than of divinity of intelligence. And that's where it's nice to see the comparison with the younger painting by Rembrandt Peale. When he sat to Stuart, as the latter has often stated, an apathy seemed to seize him, and a vacuity spread over his countenance most appalling to the painter. The best portrait painter of the age was now to take the likeness of the greatest man of all ages, and the artists and patriots of all countries were interested in it. To have failed in getting a good likeness would have been death to the artist's fame and a perpetual source of mortification to the people of the country. Stuart was, like Washington, not easily overcome. He made several fruitless attempts to awaken the heroic spirit in him by talking of battles, but in vain. He next tried to warm up the patriot and sage by turning the conversation to the Republican ages of antiquity, but this was equally unsuccessful. At length, the painter struck the master key, but of course he doesn't tell us what the master key was, and opened a way to his mind which he has so happily transferred to the canvas with the features of his face. In the whole of this picture, in every limb as well as feature, the martial air of the warrior chief is admirably mingled with the dignity and majesty of the statesman and sage. Other stories about the sitting included one told about Washington's notorious temper, which became a measure of Stuart's ability to read character in his sitter's expressions. Stuart, according to his daughter, remarked to General Henry Lee that Washington, quote, had a tremendous temper but kept it under wonderful control. And then she continues with this story. General Lee breakfasted with the President and Mrs. Washington a few days afterward. He said, "I saw your portrait the other day, a capital likeness," said the General, "but Stuart says you have a tremendous temper." "Upon my word," said Mrs. Washington, coloring, "Mr. Stuart takes a great deal upon himself to make such a remark." "But stay, my dear lady," said General Lee. He added that the President had it under wonderful control. With something like a smile, General Washington remarked, "He is right." And, subsequently we've heard stories from biographers about the famous Washington temper. This story recalls the comments of Isaac Weld, Jr., an Englishman traveling in America in 1795, who recorded the following conversation with Stuart. "Mr. Stuart, the eminent portrait painter, told me that there are features in Washington's face totally different from what he ever observed in that of any other human being. The sockets of his eyes, for instance, are larger than what he ever met with before, and the upper part of the nose broader. All his features," Stuart observed, "were indicative of the strongest and most ungovernable passions, and had he been born in the forests, it was his opinion that he would have been the fiercest man among the savage tribes." In this, Stuart has given a proof of his great discernment and intimate knowledge of the human countenance. For although General Washington has been extolled for his great moderation and calmness during the very trying situations in which he was so often placed, yet those who have been acquainted with him the longest and most intimately say that he is by nature a man of a fierce and irritable disposition, but that, like Socrates, his judgment and great self-command have always made him appear a man of a different cast in the eyes of the world. Stuart believed that he had succeeded in Washington more successfully in the second portrait than he had in the first. To him, the character of the President was better represented. He apparently achieved this with some reliance on a portrait of Washington by the French sculptor Can you change the slide on the right if the projectionist is up there? There you go. That might be a better system. He apparently achieved this with some reliance on the portrait of Washington made by Jean-Antoine Houdon, who had come to Mount Vernon in 1785 to make a life mask and this bust of Washington, which has been at Mount Vernon since it was made. The artist's daughter, Jane Stuart, later reported that of other artists' portraits of Washington, her father admired most the one by Houdon. When Stuart was asked about the comparative merits of different portraits of Washington, he's reported to have said, "Houdon's bust came first and my head of him next. When I painted Washington, he had just had a set of false teeth inserted, which accounts for the constrained expression so noticeable about his mouth and lower part of the face. Houdon's bust does not suffer from this defect, and I wanted him to look as he looked at that time." And we know that, in fact, Washington had complained about this ill-fitting set of dentures, which had been made for him by James Gardet, who was a Philadelphia dentist. And we can compare a contemporary portrait of Washington by Charles Wilson Peale, just so you can see how another artist would have painted him. Stuart asked Washington's permission to keep the unfinished Athenaeum portrait in order to fulfill commissions. According to American painter John Nagel, Mrs. Washington called often to see the general's portrait and was desirous to possess the painting. One day she called with her husband and begged to know when she might have it. The general himself never pressed it, but on this occasion, as he and his lady were about to retire, he returned to Mr. Stuart and said he saw plainly of what advantage the picture was to the painter. And he therefore begged the artist to retain the painting at his pleasure. And Jane Stuart wrote a similar story, that when General and Mrs. Washington took their last sittings, my father told Washington it would be of great importance to him to retain the originals, to which Washington replied, "Certainly, Mr. Stuart, if they are any consequence to you, I shall be perfectly satisfied with copies from your hand, as it will be impossible for me to sit again at present." Perhaps this conversation took place during that visit to Stuart's studio in January 1797, which was a month before Washington's retirement and departure from Mount Vernon. When Stuart asked to keep the original portrait from life, he was following a practice of contemporary English and French artists when they painted the official portraits of monarchs or other national rulers. Scottish artist Alan Ramsay, for example, who painted the coronation portrait of George III in 1761, employed a workshop of assistants who turned out at least 50 full-length, life-size replicas for embassies and other public settings. Artists who had painted Washington before Stuart had done this, including Charles Wilson Peale, the Swedish artist Adolf Ulrich Wertmuller, the English painter Robert H. Pine, whose work you saw, and even English pastelist James Sharples. But as far as I know, Stuart never delivered any version of the portrait of Washington to the family. And after Washington's death, his friend, the architect William Thornton, complained about this. He said, "I am sorry to be obliged to observe that the late general and his lady thought themselves extremely ill-used by Mr. Stuart, who promised repeatedly the original painting to them, and always spoke of it as appertaining to them, but never sent it, though frequently solicited. He also took Mrs. Washington's portrait, but keeps it unfinished. The original of the general, I think, ought to be Mrs. Washington's, and I think Mr. Stuart has not acted honorably in disposing of it. He thought that he had sold it. He misunderstood. I admired his genius and abilities, but his inattention to the general's family certainly was ungrateful after the general sat so repeatedly to serve Mr. Stuart. And to have possessed the original picture would have been to Mrs. Washington one of the highest gratification, and now it would be a signal consolation." So Stuart kept the Athenaeum portrait to make other paintings of the president. And one of those paintings, of course, was the one he referred to as his third portrait from life of Washington. The painting was the gift of William Bingham of Philadelphia to the Marquis of Lansdowne, so it's known as the Lansdowne Portrait. And following this British custom that Stuart ascribed to, the large portrait, which was life-size, was the most expensive form of portrait that one could commission. Its cost to Bingham was $1,000, which was 10 times the price of the smaller head and shoulders images of Washington. In the painting, Stuart repeated the face of the Athenaeum. I think you can see that. But he changed the direction of the eyes because the portrait has a narrative that he wanted to change it from looking at you to looking off to the right, because he's actually addressing Congress, and I believe that is true. The imagery in the painting celebrates Washington's role as leader of the United States during the Revolution and during the Constitutional Convention. And what I think is most important about Stuart's portraits of Washington is that it shows Washington in his civilian role as president rather than as a general. Because even within a few years earlier, when John Trumbull painted Washington, he still showed him as a general. He was dressed in the black velvet suit that he wore on public occasions, and the furniture in the painting refers to many of the elements of his career. This is the oval medallion on the back of the chair, for example, is based on the Great Seal of the United States. And the drapery of laurel over the seal is, of course, a symbol of victory. The table legs have eagles holding bundles of arrows, which are the symbols of war. And if later on you can look at your dollar bill or the dime, you can still see these images on our coinage. Under the table are books referring to Washington's career in the past, and it includes books that say American Revolution, General Orders, and then the Constitution and Laws of the United States. While on the table are books referring to the present, which are including the Journal of Congress and a copy of the Federalist Papers. Also on the table are some blank papers and a silver inkwell with a pen. And the inkwell is in the shape of an ark resting on the back of dogs and is engraved with the Washington family coat of arms. And then in the background, you can see this clearing sky and the rainbow. And at the time that a version of this was exhibited in New York, it was described as a painting of Washington surrounded with allegorical emblems of his public life in the service of his country, which are highly illustrative of the great and tremendous storms that have frequently prevailed. These storms, and of course he means the figurative storms as well as literally the war. These storms have abated, and the appearance of the rainbow is introduced in the background as a sign. Washington painted 7 versions of this full-length portrait, but it was the Athenaeum portrait that became the one that Stuart painted, the one that Stuart painted the most during his long career. Stuart himself made over 75 painted copies, each measuring about 30 by 25 inches. He called them his $100 bills because this was his price for a portrait that size. To own one of the replicas was a sign of your admiration of Washington. These replicas are compositional abbreviations of the Athenaeum portrait, and as Stuart aged, the versions become less precise and more quickly painted. The one I'm showing you first was painted in Philadelphia within about a year of when Stuart painted George Washington from life. It was owned by Charles Baring, an Englishman who was a nephew of Francis Baring of London, of eventually Baring Brothers, the bank. And it was one of the earliest ones to be painted. And you can see that the lace shirt frill is very ornate, and there's a lot of work that's gone into painting that. Whereas a much later version, about almost 10 years later, which was owned by Massachusetts Senator Jonathan Mason, is much more abbreviated. Jonathan Mason persuaded Stuart to move to Boston in 1805, and it was after that that Stuart painted this portrait of Washington for him. The versions painted in Boston are often on wood panels and are slightly smaller than the earlier ones on canvas. But of course, immediately, just to indicate the popularity of Stuart's portrait, immediately other artists began to copy it and make engravings. And we had no copyright law in the United States at this time, so other artists could easily copy an artist's work. One enterprising Philadelphia merchant even arranged to send one of Stuart's portraits to China so that copies could be made by a Chinese artist. It's not a very good slide, but that a large number of these came back, were shipped back to Philadelphia, and were offered for sale in 1802. And Stuart took the merchant to court and won the case. And his argument was that he was depending on the income from these copies to support his family. And that was a persuasive case, but of course there was no way that he could appeal to the idea of a copyright. The Athenaeum portrait was also copied by his daughter. This is Jane Stuart's copy, later as late as possibly the 1870s. And of course, nowadays we all know the copy that's on the $1 bill. There he is the dollar bill in reverse. And also one of the most famous copies is that copy that was made in 1932 when we had the bicentennial and celebration of the anniversary of Washington's birth. And Congress, among other things, commissioned this lithograph. And I'm told that over 1 million copies of the lithograph were circulated. And I think some of us even remember seeing them in schools or post offices. This is a photograph from a mining town in California, an old mining town, Bodie, California. And it's up on the wall of the post office in the town. In contrast to this large number of copies, we have no copies by Stuart of Martha Washington's portrait. We have a few copies by other artists, but none by Stuart. And so I'll just end by saying that Stuart's Washington was a success from the start. It depicted Washington as president, not as general. And because of Stuart's painting skills, it conveyed to its audiences a lifelike image of the leader they wished to remember. And I think it's the one that we all remember best today. So thank you all very much. We can have questions, or we can, how about 2 or 3 questions if anybody wants to ask things that are puzzling? Yes.
Were all the portraits of Washington with a wig? Some of them look like almost regular hair, and some are gray, and it's different. Obviously, I think this is...
He didn't wear a wig. By this time, I think most Americans did not wear wigs. Since the Revolution. They powdered their hair. And so what you're seeing is powdered hair. And in fact, I didn't include the slide of a miniature that shows his actual hair color on the back. He had sort of auburn brown hair, quite different from the white powdered hair that we see in the portraits. Yes?
When these portraits are in the museum, I take children through this gallery. They always ask, why aren't they finished? And it's my question to you. Why wasn't more of the...
Well, it's interesting. Later on in the 20s, when someone asked him if he was going to finish the portraits, he said no, that they're much more valuable this way. And I think what he meant was not monetarily, well, he might have, with Stuart, he might have, but he also meant, I think, this is the fresh image of the president that I painted from life. And I don't want to add anything to it that will sort of make it unlifelike. So I think it's to retain the lifelike quality of the painting. And it's true, when you can see it up close, the brushwork is so fresh. I mean, the way the darks and lights are placed on the canvas is, and when you stand back from it, I think that's what gives it its fleshy quality. Yes?
You raised the question
The ownership in terms of the Athenaeum, or?
The ownership between Stuart and the Washingtons. Mrs. Washington commissioned him.
Well, there's no record. See, this is the frustration. There's absolutely no record of payment or of a letter saying, you know, I'm commissioning the portraits or anything. So I
from the person after Mr. Washington's death.
Right.
Was very disingenuous and not correct. Saying Mrs. Washington, you treated the family poorly.
Well, I think William Thornton was. I think he was so close to Washington, and Washington had just died. He wrote that letter within a few months of Washington's death. And I think he felt, he was trying to say, Mrs. Washington, it would mean a lot to her to have the portraits. And I think what's so interesting for us today is that, in fact, she did commission them. I mean, we don't often think about how did these things come about, but think about it. It took, well, you didn't realize this about but Mrs. Bingham persuaded Washington to sit for the Lansdowne. So it took a rare individual close to Washington to even persuade him at that point in his life to sit for a portrait. So even if there was no money that had changed hands, the fact that Mrs. Washington was able to convince Washington to sit meant that it was her commission. That's the way I would interpret that letter. Yes? With Stuart, generally what we understand is there were about 3 or 4 2-hour sittings. But during those sittings, he didn't paint the rest of the picture. He usually just did the head and maybe a hand. And then he painted the rest of the pictures, usually when the person wasn't present. Oh, more questions? Yes?
How many copies of the Lansdowne portrait did
He did, I said 7 right now, but in fact there are 2 different poses. If you total up both the gesture of speaking and then the later version that he did after Washington died, there are 7 that I know of that he did. Yes?
Alan, you mentioned specifically Stuart's knowledge of Reynolds and Gainsborough during his time in England. What specifically, if anything, do you think he owes to those great portraits?
Well, he owes a lot of his career to Reynolds. Reynolds sent quite a few sitters his way after he left West Studio. But also he painted Reynolds' portrait, and I think he imitated Reynolds' technique often. But Gainsborough, the more broken surface of Gainsborough is also very much a part of Stuart's painting technique, although they're not as broken and as loosely painted as a Gainsborough portrait. They're probably closer to Reynolds in their technique. Okay, well, thank you all very much.